Good afternoon. On behalf of Minnesota Law, we welcome you to today's CLE offering. Today's CLE topic will make the case for the presence of crisis management and the necessity of having skills to manage crisis communications as a lawyer, and hopefully leave you with some practical tips on how to start building these skills. For the requisite housekeeping notes, today's webinar is being recorded, and the link to the recording will be shared via email following the event. We have live audio captioning enabled. Please click the live transcript feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to view or hide these captions throughout today's discussion. We will do our best to respond to questions that you submit through the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please send those in at any time, and we'll see if we can get to as many of those as possible during our discussion. With that, let's meet our panelists for today's CLE. First, Stacy Bettison is a summa cum laude graduate of Emerson College in Communications, Political Science, and Law, and a magna cum laude and Order of the Coif graduate from the University of Minnesota Law School. She practiced law at Jenner and Block in Chicago and Green Espel in Minneapolis, representing corporate and governmental clients. She handled cases in environmental law, intellectual property, employment discrimination, land use, products liability, toxic tort, and construction law. She counseled clients on regulatory matters and occupational safety and health issues. Stacy's passion for communications and helping people led her to a career in crisis communications, business and corporate communications, and drawing on extensive legal experience, litigation communications. Stacy is the founder and president of Bettison, a public relations firm in the Twin Cities, where she combines a unique blend of legal experience, business acumen, strategic thinking. She works with regional, national, and global businesses, organizations, and individual clients, helping them overcome communications challenges and taking advantage of media opportunities. So we thank her for being with us today. We also have with us Chris Schmitter, the Chief of Staff for the Office of Governor Tim Walz, and Lieutenant Governor Peggy Flynn. As the state's Chief Operating Officer, he oversees a 60-person office, 24 state agencies, more than 40,000 state employees, while effectuating the governor's agenda. He drives state agencies to make progress on the governor's strategic goals, strengthens business partnerships, and promotes investment and innovation in Minnesota. He serves as Walz's top advisor and for all key administrative hires and for appointments to state boards and commissions and the judiciary. As Chief of Staff, he also works with the communications team to oversee the administration's communication strategy. This includes both proactive messaging and reactive and crisis communication scenarios. Before joining the governor's staff, Chris practiced with Green Espel after clerking for the Honorable Sidney Thomas of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and for the Honorable Judge Thunheim in the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota. He graduated from the University of Minnesota Law School, summa cum laude, Order of the Coif in 2013, where he served as the editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Law Review. He is a magna cum laude graduate of Georgetown University and worked as deputy chief of staff and legislative director for a member of the U.S. House of Representatives before attending law school. So to our panelists, again, welcome and thank you so much for your time and for sharing your insights with us today. And then let's dig into our topic. So for starters, how do so many crises that seemingly have no legal issue in the beginning devolve into or start to involve a legal crisis?
Well, I'll go first. I think one of the things to note is that once a crisis has become public, and maybe it hasn't even become public yet, it's just internal. There's vulnerability. A crisis creates vulnerability, and when that vulnerability has become known to whether it's the public or internally, that is one reason why there's potential legal exposure, because there's the understanding or observation from people who are close to the crisis or maybe impacted by the crisis that may have legal claims, or there may be legal issues that are impacting them. The other thing I would say is a lot of crises, that don't start off with a legal issue, as as the crisis continues to unfold, the legal issues become known. And so on the surface, it may seem like, oh, we have this problem, but actually, as we dig into what is this problem and how are we going to solve it, we understand that there's layers, and it's like peeling back the onion and getting into now we have actually some real legal issues that we need to figure out.
Yeah, I'll jump in too, and just maybe I would just start by saying, David, thanks for moderating, and honored to be a part of the CLE, and Stacy, you're one of the absolute best at this. So I'm honored to be able to participate in this CLE with you. I would echo everything you said, Stacy, and maybe just to build on what you said. In my experience, it also feels like as a crisis plays out publicly, sometimes, in fact, mistakes in how one handles the crisis can lead to legal vulnerability, right? Which sort of adds to, I think, part of the reason why a CLE like this is important is that not only is everything that Stacy said right about how the issues and the vulnerabilities and potential legal liability becomes more evident as a crisis continues and plays out, but in fact, parties or participants or folks who are engaged in it can make missteps, frankly, in how they talk about it, how they communicate about it, that can create or exacerbate legal liability. And it's part of why I think it's really important to think through how you're communicating in a crisis moment.
Yeah, thank you. So how has the digital age and social media impacted the way that crises are managed now? It seems like the old no comment approach is no longer as functional, and there's a greater need to control your own story and message, and often to comment on something that's being sort of forced into the public view.
Yeah, maybe I'm happy to jump in on this one, and I think about this through a few different lenses. Obviously, one kind of in my current role, but also as a former litigator at Green Espel, and I think the question you just asked, David, highlights it well, which is that there's generally folks are processing information in a lot of different ways, and some of that is through traditional media, but some of that is through digital media and social media, and it's a lot more rapid fire, and it's a lot more direct, and it can be instantaneous. And so I think the way you pose the question is right. That to work through a crisis and not engage doesn't really work. I don't know that it works with traditional media, but I also think, especially because of the conversation and the chatter that can happen in social media that can then drive traditional media coverage, I think it's important to engage and respond. And in doing so, you have to think through: am I adding more fuel to the fire, if you will, of a story that's playing out? You got to give that some due consideration. But I think in general, it's really important to be transparent, to be honest, to have a clear message that you all agree to internally that you can then use publicly, and to address inaccuracies, right? And to try to stop those inaccuracies from gaining legs. And you can only do that so much in the digital social media space, but you want to try, especially so that it doesn't, kind of get into the traditional media space. And I think that's obviously important in the public sector, but I think it's important in the private sector too, where brand and reputation matter a lot.
Oh, yeah, and, I was, as you were talking, I was thinking about, the fact that some crises start out as social media crises, right? It's a digital crisis. Something is happening on social media, and then that creates the crisis. And I've handled social media crises that then go into a traditional media context. The traditional media covers this problem that is happening on social media, or became to light on social media. Um, so um, that's one thing to keep in mind, is that social media is a platform that can be the source of your crises. How has it changed or impacted the way it's managed? Um, One obvious thing is there are more channels and more platforms that people need to be mindful of in terms of where do we need to be communicating? How do we need to be getting our message out? Do we put it out here? Do we put it on our website? Do we say something on Facebook or not? How do we engage? Do we engage on social media? Or do we try to keep this more contained? That's a consideration that we're always talking about when I'm working with organizations and businesses that have something going on is what do we change? What do we put out on social media? Always a question. Certainly how the digital age and social media has impacted the way crises are managed is that you have more citizen journalists who aren't necessarily trained as journalists, don't have the ethics of journalists, aren't really concerned with portraying not necessarily an unbiased account of what's going on, but they're just not interested in trying to flesh out facts and put out all the information. They're interested in putting one side out. So that's a whole nother CLE about how to deal with citizen journalists. And then of course, how digital and social media has changed the way crises are managed is that you just it's an opportunity for pile on, right? People just start piling on, and that can, in the way we've managed crises and worked with clients at Bedison, that's a very stressful experience for people to see the comments, and the engagement or the posts. It's very stressful because it feels like the crisis is getting bigger. It's getting bigger because there's more comments. It's like, is it really getting bigger, or is it just going through the arc of the crisis, the life of the crisis? And one of the things that we think about when we're going through that and we've got a social media aspect is, do we engage on social media, or do we pull back and stick to this is how we're going to communicate, and this is what we're going to, this is our plan. The plan can get really, the plan can, be subject to change if things are out of control on social media. But, I've written about, is it best to keep your head down or to go in? I've counseled clients sometimes, don't respond to those comments, because you're going to get absolutely nowhere, and it's just going to fan the flames. And then sometimes, there are times where a response might be needed. And it's a careful response and it's strategic. And then you just have to be prepared for the next phase of what that might bring.
How do you go about educating or counseling clients or officials on social media and the risks that it may offer or the opportunities that it may offer if social media is not really familiar to them, or only really familiar in a personal context rather than in a professional context?
You want to go first on that one, Stacy?
Sure. A lot of the clients that I've worked with have, some sort of internal capability that's managing that social media aspect. For those who are unfamiliar with it, there can be a lot of anxiety around, what they don't know. They don't know, and they're kind of imagining this worst case scenario, and that everything that it's going to become so bad that they're never going to be able to recover, that their reputation is now being dictated by, a running stream of comments or, a post or whatever. And to some extent that, it's a valid point of anxiety. It's very terrible for you to see kind of, things unfolding on social media because you have no control over it. And that's how it's different than traditional media. Traditional media, typically, someone's doing a story, you have an opportunity to participate, the story comes out, maybe there's a letter to the editor, maybe you have a Q&A set to respond to, whether it's customers, whatever stakeholders you need to after the story runs, and then you can quickly build, get back to business. social media feels like there's this long life. And I think with clients, that what I try to do is explain, this is how this is going to work. This is how, this is what you can expect. And that it doesn't necessarily relieve the anxiety, but it certainly gives them an understanding if they're not very familiar with what to expect. Um, at least they have some sort of roadmap of, here's what we can expect on social media. And this is, maybe a time frame. But even those, kind of predictions, or in my experience, I could say, this is what I would expect. The crazy thing about crisis communications and crises is, I think everyone can agree, is that you don't always know what's coming next, right? There's surprises.
I think I would just maybe add, um, I think building on what you're saying, Stacy, is that in some ways it feels like the harder thing, whether it's the public sector or private sector, the harder thing in terms of educating on social media is to convince someone that not to stress about it, right? Because even if you're not an expert on social media, you can be a public official, you can be a public entity, you can be a private company. To Stacy's point, you start seeing comments and sort of a blow up on social media, and it feels really stressful, and it feels personal, and it's easy to get into a defensive posture. And so I think, like Stacy said, it's really good advice. A lot of it's about educating, um, on on the fact that in sort of social and digital media, just like in traditional media, there are, kind of limits to how far a story is going to travel, that there are life cycles to it. And it might not go the same way as a traditional kind of media life cycle, but it's still something that, even if it's hard to predict, that is not endless, right? And that, depending on the social media platform we're talking about, it may not be that the reach is going to be anywhere near as great as if something's in the newspaper or something's on local news or cable news or so forth. And so I think educating on, look, maybe this is a case where we should be responding and engaging on social media, but if it's not, and if it's one where it's better to, like you said, Stacy, put your head down, it's more important to walk through with whoever it is you're counseling, why in not responding or engaging on social media, that's okay, and that there is going to be a life cycle to it, and it is going to die down. And I think that's a complicated thing. And I think the best thing to do, the best way to do that, in my experience, is to have examples, right? Is to have examples as best you can, either ones that you've managed yourself or ones that you've seen play out publicly, where something has sort of blown up, if you will, in a social digital media space, and be able to walk through, okay, here's what happened, here's when it died down, and by the way, here's how that social or digital media blow up, if you will, played out in traditional media or not, right? And sometimes that relationship or lack thereof can be further evidence that it's not something to get all that stressed about.
General counsels and others in similar positions have to deal with this reality that their case is going to play out both in the legal system and potentially in the judicial system, but also on this sort of vast canvas of public discourse. And what role does knowing how the court will deal with something, but also how the public image of your company may be affected, affect what lawyers have to do and how they have to think about this? How do lawyers dealing with crisis management balance, essentially? What are the repercussions to the brand or message or image that you're presenting? If they're negative, especially even if you might win in court.
I'm happy to start here, Stacy, then turn it to you. But I think, part of it, to me, and Stacy, you know better, but part of it feels like just the initial premise is just, acknowledging, as a lawyer, legal practitioner, that the public response and the sort of the public opinion piece of it is a really important factor, right? Like you know, Stacy experienced at great firms, Green Espel, like myself, practicing at Green Espel. That's a law firm that, in my experience, super talented lawyers, and understands the relationship between public opinion and what's playing out in court or in the legal system. And just starting with that understanding helps you then convince clients or folks you're counseling that that's an issue. And I think you just have to start there, because that's not always the case, and not every client, not every person you're counseling is going to think of it that way, right? And obviously, it's a little bit different public sector versus private sector. In the public sector, with elected officials, we think all the time about public opinion. That we face elections, and so we think about it differently. It's more second nature in this space. But I do think starting with that premise matters. And then I think a big question in my mind, depending on the client or the entity that we're counseling, is, you know, what is the public brand? What is the public profile? And how important is it, right? And we certainly see with a lot of our big, great Minnesota companies, and certainly with elected officials, and some of our state agencies, for instance, there is a public brand. There's a public brand and a public reputation that is known and saturates. And so, take our state agencies just as an example, right? The Department of Public Safety, or the Driver and Vehicle Services subdivision, where folks get their license and registration, the Department of Revenue, right? Those are public entities that have a public brand and an interaction with the public that people know. There are other state agencies that have less of that, right? That don't interface with the public as much. And so I think it kind of acknowledging the premise, but then assessing, okay, based on who my client is, or my public or private, whatever entity in counseling, how deep and how deeply saturated is their public profile and brand, and then based on that, right, assessing, okay, now we're facing a legal challenge that may tarnish that brand. What's to Stacy's point earlier, what's the life cycle of that legal crisis? And so then what impact do we think it's going to have on the brand? So for instance, if we think it's some sort of entity that's got a pretty limited public profile, pretty limited public brand, and it's a minor crisis that's not going to play out over very much time, that's one thing and not as big of a concern. If it's a bigger issue that we think is really going to tarnish the brand, and we think it's an entity that's got a really big public profile where the brand matters, that's a much bigger concern. And I'll say in my experience, certainly working in the political space, what's amazing is it takes a lot for something to saturate, right? I think people forget something blowing up over a day or two in a couple of news stories or in social media doesn't mean that it's saturated. And so I think, again, there's got to be more of a life cycle, and it's got to be an entity that's got a real public brand. And then if that's the case, then you got to have a plan for it. And you generally, I think, have to have some experts who know how to manage that space and can help you deal with that, just as you have to do it in the legal system.
That's great, Chris. Love everything you said. I jotted some notes down on this question, and I will say this. Brands are damaged and brands come back. People get reputationally, they get damaged and they come back. And we've seen this over and over again. I mean, I'm just, examples, Toyota, when they went through a horrible, horrible recall with their cars, BP oil, the spill, years of just awfulness, they come back. People, Tiger Woods, for example, I don't know if he's fully come back, but we'll just give him the benefit of the doubt that he is back and he's doing his thing. But I mean, he was involved in some, pretty, negative things. And then, we just see him playing golf, just recently. He's back, he's doing his thing. What I tell clients too is this is going to feel bad for a while. And it's going to feel like, the sky is falling. And sometimes, maybe it really is. But there's a way, and it always happens, that we can turn it around and you come back. And so this feeling of like, oh, we're going to be tarnished and our business is ruined. Yes, that can happen if there's not a very strategic and thoughtful way of managing the crisis, of course. And mismanaged crises can cause further, reputational damage. But once this kind of, like we talked about, these cycles, there are cycles, there's life cycles, because it kind of runs out of steam, and then people go on living their lives. They're picking up their kids at school, and they're making dinner, and they're paying their taxes, and and doing their things. So people forget, and people do forget. Um, and that's the opportunity where you go in and say, okay, what is the damage? Assess the damage, if you can, and then you start building. And it's a process, and I have seen it time and time again from individuals, nonprofits, businesses, small and large. They're going through something. It feels like we might have to shut our, we might have to shut our doors. And it's, no, we don't. We're just going to get through this, and we will come back. And I've talked to clients, when the crisis has passed and there's been the rebuild, or just maybe some time has passed, and they come back and they're like, we're doing fine. Our business has never been better. They're back. It didn't feel like that in the moment. It felt like everything everything that they had built was falling apart. So that's what I would say to, organizations that are or individuals that are going through it. It's, you got to see it through, have patience, be deliberate and strategic while you're going through it. And then you hatch a plan to move forward. And sometimes I tell clients, we're going to get through this, and then it's business as usual. You just keep going, you do your business, stay focused on your mission. What's your mission? Do that, because that's where your goodwill is. Whatever you're doing in the community or business or whatever, that's where you're earning your goodwill every day, is by doing what you do, the best way you do it. So get back to business.
And it seems incredibly helpful. I'm sure the participants would like to hear some more specifics. So maybe I should ask you, what are some typical mistakes that organizations and councils make in crisis communications? And why do they keep happening with organizations that we might not expect them to?
Mistakes. Um, so why do mistakes happen in crisis response?
Yeah.
Because humans are responding, because we're human and we make mistakes. That's one. I always like to just think like, we're all humans doing the best we can, and sometimes we don't have all the information, which gets to, you got to collect your information. One is, why are mistakes made? There's not a clear objective. What is the objective? When we're going through a crisis, there's the crisis in terms of containing that or dealing with that substantive issue. And then there's the communicating about it. So if you bungle the response to the crisis, certainly that is why that's a mistake. You've got to make sure that your response to the crisis is spot on. And then how you're communicating about what you're doing. We made this mistake, we are fixing it. We, have done this to make sure it doesn't happen again, and moving forward, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that another reason crisis or mistakes happen is that we misjudge our audience. We misjudge the stakeholders. We don't do a thoughtful analysis of what are their primary concerns. The primary concern is, how is this going to affect me? It's not about how is it going to affect the company, the organization, or the person. It's how does this affect, them? And I think as we're going through a crisis, as that I've counseled clients, their focus is on themselves naturally, right? Because they're going through it. But it's like, it's not about you. It's about all of them. And so let's think about them right now. And I think that mistakes happen when that focus is shifted inward and not outward. And then, yeah, I think that's what I would say on that. And I did see the question that it would be helpful to discuss a specific crisis. And I can do that. I'll be a little bit oblique about it because I don't like to name names of my clients. I'm sure they would not appreciate me being on a CLE talking about their crisis in public, but I can obliquely talk about that. Chris, did you want to provide input on the mistake piece?
The mistake, yeah, maybe I agree with everything you said, and Stacey, and I would just add, in my experience, I feel like we're, and sort of, seeing this play out, whether it's in Minnesota or nationally, it feels like one space where mistakes really happen is, you know, the facts, and you said this, Stacy, right? The facts dictate the degree of the crisis, right? I mean, you know, to the second question in the Q&A about are there examples of where you don't recover from a crisis? I mean, part of that is fact driven. Of course, you can't control that, right? You're kind of coming in and managing a crisis after it's happening. And there are some cases where you look at some of what's happened with Boeing and the 737 MAX, both early on and then more recently. You know, in the end, the facts are what they are. And in both a legal dispute, but also in the court of public opinion, similarly, if the facts are really, really bad, that's going to dictate your ability to kind of get through it and recover and how important it is. And you can only control that, right, so much. I mean, you can hopefully stop from creating more bad facts in a crisis situation and fix things, but the facts really drive it. To me, a really critical mistake is not understanding those facts, right? So if you're an organization, whether it be public or private, you and whoever's helping you, your lawyers, your PR consultants, whoever's helping you, you have to stop. You have to stop in a crisis moment. You have to understand the facts really clearly. You got to understand what happened. And you have to make sure that every relevant player internally understands what happened. And then you have to figure out how to stop whatever bad thing happened from continuing to happen. And then you got to figure out how to talk about it and to whom and in what level of detail, right? And to me, that seems pretty straightforward, but in a crisis scenario is very hard to do. And because it requires real calm and focus in a time when that's the last thing you want to be doing. And it requires, very clear alignment and organization, right? And it's, we do this in state government, we do it in the governor's office. We think through it, not set aside a crisis scenario, but whenever we're talking about something, we think about what we're saying, but also who we're saying it to, and in as much detail as possible, down to the minute. If we're rolling out some big decision or some big announcement, we call it a TikTok. Who are we talking to and when, and who's doing it? And that level of organization is, I think, really, really important. And I think when you see mistakes playing out, they've missed one piece of it or the other. They have not ground themselves in the facts, or not everybody's ground themselves in the facts. And then they've not done the additional work of working out what they're going to say, to whom and when. And so you have folks saying things publicly that aren't accurate, that aren't grounded in the facts, and that are not aligned with what other people are saying. And my biggest advice to anybody is, when you're in this sort of moment, you have to force yourself, and it may be early in the morning or late at night, but you've got to force yourself to do that really deep, intensive work of figuring out facts, what you're saying, and who you're saying it to and when.
Yeah, and I would add on to that, the question that often comes to me is, what are we going to say? And my question back is, well, what are we doing? So that's oftentimes the first question in any crisis is, what are we doing to manage this? Because what we do will dictate what we say. Because certainly we're not going to say anything that we're not doing. That's not honest, and that's not right. But so we have to figure out, what are we going to do? And then, well, what are we going to do? Well, what's the right thing to do? What's the ethical thing to do? What's the transparent thing to do? And that really impacts the communications. If the response is, well, we don't really want to do the full thing, we want to do kind of half it, or we wanted to kind of try to make it go away. Well, that's fine, as long as there's a message that can be, if there's a message that needs to be put out, how do you say that? And if we can't make a message that's going to really be impactful and persuasive and assure people, or provide, like Chris said, clear information, then that is not the right course of action. And so I always go back to this, what are we going to say? Well, what are we going to do? Because whatever we do is going to dictate what we say. And so sometimes communications guide the action, because it's like, well, we can't say that. And it's like, right. And so we're not going to do that, right? They play on each other.
I just want to build on that, Stacy, to two things. Number one, I think you really hit on, before you get into a crisis scenario, set aside whether you've got the right systems in place to manage that, whatever the facts are, right? Core values of an organization matter, right? And so, you know, uh, uh, you know, and it relates to crisis situations and crisis communications more than you'd think. But we have core values and guiding principles as an administration and state government, for instance, and included in those are transparency and sort of doing what's right even when it's hard, et cetera. And those really help because you need those. I always think of it like guardrails or like bumpers. If you're bowling, you need guardrails that tell people across your organization how to do the work they're doing and what to do in a crisis. And those guardrails will help you get out of it, right? Because you've got the guardrails that tell you, well, we got to be transparent and we got to fix it in this way. That's important. But the second thing is, Stacy, that to me, I'm sort of just want to applaud what you're saying because I feel like so often as the communications expert, your folks ask exactly what you just said. They say, well, what should we say? And they forget that, no, that's not the communications or PR expert who's helping you think through it, which you need, can't cannot tell you perfectly what to say if you're not, as the organization, thinking through substantively what you can say, right? Like if you're not willing to take the steps to fix it, if you don't have a solution to talk about, no amount of PR expertise can fix that problem for you. And it's very easy to look to the communications expert to give you the right words. But if you don't have the substantive solution, that's kind of an impossible ask of that person. Or I'm sure you've done this, Stacy, I've done it, or the communications sort of expert may say, well, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to tell you what you have to say for this to work. And that can be sort of uncomfortable. Sometimes then communications will drive the solution, but you also have to be ready for that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Chris. I mean, I feel like sometimes my work as a crisis communications or reputation, management consultant is, yes, they come to me asking, what are we going to say about it? But then it really ends up being, there's a lot of operations and logistics that the role that I end up playing is, okay, we got to get this people at the table that, and then we got to figure out this, what are we going to do? When are we going to do it? How fast can we do it? And then, and how do we communicate about that? So, well, so I just wanted to, if this is an okay time, Professor, to look at a couple of questions in the Q&A. I wanted to address the most recent one first because it's a short answer. How much time does one typically have to investigate before needing to respond about the crisis? And that's, based on the typical arc. So my answer to that is it depends. Classic, lawyer response, but it really depends on how much public information is known about what is happening. If it's really an internal issue, you can take some time. Now, I've dealt with situations where we have an internal issue, but we're not sure if someone internally is going to go outside and make our internal business known. So that's always a risk. So internally. Now, if it's something really public facing that's happening really quickly, it's fast. I've gotten calls where, we need help and we're just moving and it's right away. But what I've counseled, to try to get to the answer, what I've counseled clients on is you may need time to investigate and you don't want to be putting out information that you don't have, that you're not sure of, that you haven't truth grounded. And so one way to communicate about in this time of we're still investigating is to put out something that this has happened, we're on it, we are investigating. As soon as we have more information, we will come back. And that way people know, oh, okay, they're responsive, they're on it, and we'll wait for more information. So that's communication, just saying, yep, we'll come back. So I hope that answers the question on timing and how much time there is to investigate. Chris, if you wanted to add into anything to that, I certainly, you should.
I know I would just echo what you said. I think there's there's a lot of power in whether you call it a holding statement or whatever, something that I do think often you do have to, you got to say something immediately. And this is where those core values help, right? Like
Yeah.
if you know what to say, go back to the core values of the organization. Look, something has happened. We care deeply about our stakeholders, our customers, our constituents, what have you, and we care deeply about transparency. We got to figure out what's going on, and we'll get back. But and we'll get back to you quickly. And by the way, we take responsibility, right? I think one of the things that I'm biased. Obviously, one of the things I love about working for Tim Walz is that he's not a defensive guy. He's somebody who sort of he'll say, okay, look, buck stops with me. I'm in charge. If it comes to state government, I take responsibility. We'll figure out more. And for any organization, going back to those core values, saying I take responsibility, we're on it, and then coming back with more facts later, that's okay. But you have to move fast, obviously. And so to Stacy's point, you got to, as you're doing that initial statement, you should be thinking through what's the series of meetings I have to have. And that may be as 24 hours, 36 hours, really fast. But to Stacy's point, you definitely have to say something right away, but then give yourself the time as fast as you can, but give yourself the time to get those facts down, because you're only going to make things worse if you're saying things that are totally wrong.
Well, yeah, you say something and then later you say something else that contradicts what you said before because you spoke too soon.
And then back to the first question, you may then create legal liability, right? Maybe there's a legal issue you didn't even realize that you've now created because you've said conflicting things or the wrong thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, and if you speak quickly, as you said, from your core values, then you're more likely to be saying something that your organization or institution is going to do and follow up with, right? Because it's within their values.
Right.
But if you haven't planned it very carefully first, it may not be in the way that you stated it, and you've created this problem, without the planning. I think it would be helpful. I think it'd be useful for both of you to return to that question Stacy raised from the panelists or from the participants earlier. As a moderator, I think one of my greatest services, if I could get both of you to discuss maybe a specific crisis, and then through the thought process and the game plan and how that resolved, just so that it gives listeners an idea of what's the thought process in dealing with this, what's a game plan they might follow.
Sure. Well, I've been thinking about that question, which is why I took the third one first. So to John Novak's question, fair question. The one I'm going to tell, I'll try to tell the best I can. I was contacted by a company who had an issue that was had an issue that was unfolding in the public, in the media, in the public very quickly, but they weren't named. They weren't involved in the problem. Now, and then I said I was going to be a little bit oblique, and I apologize if this feels really oblique, but they were related to the problem, and so they knew that their name was going to come up eventually. And they have a very strong reputation in the community for years. And what was happening was going to have a very, very negative impact on them. And they knew that it was coming. And so we had to plan for, okay, when our name does come up on this issue, we need to be clear about what our role was and was not. What we knew and what we did not, and communicate as clearly as we can, but the objective was to keep our distance because we weren't involved in the issue, but they had a connection to it, and so that was the process. We watched, we waited, we responded to media inquiries. With a statement. So there was requests for interviews. That's another area where requests for interviews, I tend to in crisis, I tend to do statements rather than interviews because they're easier to control unless your interviewee is very experienced with the media or does need to do an interview for any variety of reasons. Statements are That's how I typically advise. So we got a statement ready. We had to vet it through the hierarchy of the organization. That took time, right? Like the clock was ticking, and someone was on vacation, and so we had to get the statement written, get it vetted, get it ready, and then the news cycle started, and their name did come into the news cycle. They started getting some negative blowback on social media, on their Google reviews. The question was, did we respond? No, we did not put out a statement on Facebook or other social media. We didn't put anything on the website. Again, the objective was we didn't have a role in this. And so we're not going to play an active role in communicating. We will communicate something, but we wanted to keep our distance. And that was the objective. That's what we did. A couple of other media inquiries came up. And I worked with media to tell them there's really no story here. What you're digging for does not exist. And that's all I have, that's all I got. And so the media petered out on our client. And so that was a success in terms of we had some reputational damage coming. We could see the tsunami, and it was kind of a keep your head down but be responsive. I hope that's helpful to John's question and provides enough specificity that you can understand what that cycle was like.
I think maybe what I would add, without going into a bunch of specifics about I'm anything, and maybe the past few years, I think that there's in the public sector space, but also the private sector. To me, the example that might be helpful to think of is the one that runs a little bit counter to what someone, what Stacey and I have been talking about, which is what's an issue or a crisis that is, as opposed to short term or acute, actually longer term and harder to manage. And in the government space, what comes to mind is where operationally, functionally, something hasn't worked. And so the example that I think a lot of folks use is in the last 15 years or so is the Affordable Care Act. And the President Obama, Democratic Congress passed the Affordable Care Act, and set aside the policy or the politics of it and what you might think about it, set aside later Supreme Court decisions around it, et cetera. From a functional standpoint, one of the biggest vulnerabilities that the Affordable Care Act faced was the website and the interface launching in a way that was really problematic, right? And you face that at the state government level, the driver's license and registration system. I mentioned, MNLARS was the state system that both Governor Dayton and Governor Walz have dealt with. And so, whether you're a private company, and we see this, with private companies all the time too, or your public sector government, when a service or a product you're providing people doesn't work, that to me is a core example of a sort of crisis that you might face. And in my mind, if you take the Affordable Care Act or you take MNLARS, you think of the life cycle. A lot of what we've talked about to me is how you handle it. Okay, we didn't quite understand at the executive level, let's say, in the White House, let's say, that the launch was going to play out in this way. And okay, we should probably have a conversation about what our process is for approving IT launches and come back to that. But set that aside. Now here we are. So once again, you've got to have that values-based statement that says, this is what we know and think right now in the moment. You got to dig in, though quickly behind the scenes on the facts and figure out what your solution is going to be. You got to communicate that solution and know what you're saying and to whom as you communicate about it, and then prepare for any kind of attendant legal risk, litigation, etc. But I think the challenge in these sorts of cases is it takes a lot of time. So it took a lot of time on the Affordable Care Act website to get it back up to where it needed to be, right? It took a lot of time on the MNLARS driver's license registration system to get it to the place it needed to be. And so, you might go through one crisis life cycle, and then there's another that comes down the road, and then another. And in my mind, in these longer term examples, I think you can use some of what Stacy and I have been talking about to get you through the immediate term. But then I think you have to build sort of a rhythm, if you will, of how you're going to deal with it and manage it ongoing in a way that does not distract from the rest of the both proactive and reactive work you need to be doing. And that may be having a whole separate team that's managing it, or it may be that you just know that your existing team is gonna check in on it regularly. Um, the other type of crisis I think though that's worth talking about is one that is, could be short term, could be long term, but we see these a lot in the public sector. It's not it's not something that the public sector has, that your entity has created, but it's now something that you're responsible for. So the obvious example in state government would be COVID, right? And we could spend a whole bunch of time talking about that. But whether you're Governor Walz or states all across the country, governors in particular, and the federal level, but really governors had to step forward on COVID. And that was a short term, but then really a long term crisis response that required deploying some of the lessons that Stacy and I have talked about. But again, it's not something that we created, right? The state government had nothing to do with creating this pandemic, but we're responsible for the response. And so those are crises nonetheless. And I think in those cases, a lot of the same principles apply. And to me, it's worth mentioning them only because you might not realize as an organization that in those sorts of situations, if you're not deploying the lessons that Stacy and I are talking about, you can be held just as much responsible as for a crisis that your own organization created. Private sector deals with this all the time too, right? You can be, if you're an airline dealing with weather that you're responding to as opposed to mechanical issues, it matters just as much that you are responding in an accountable way that your stakeholders expect you to respond with. And if you don't, you can suffer just as much as for one that your organization might be responsible for. So those are two more specific examples that I'm thinking of, if that's helpful.
So there's no crisis communications 101 course in law school, although I'm going to make a note of that because maybe we ought to start having that. How can today's lawyers build a skill set that prepares them to do this kind of work? It definitely is one of those things that is important to the role of being a lawyer that traditionally law school doesn't address.
So I'm happy to take that quickly. I think that there's an ethical rule that that applies to lawyers about. I don't have it in front of me, and I can't recite it from memory, but it goes to safeguarding the client and being aware of impacts to business. And so the reason I say that is because if there's a legal issue, whether it's a litigation or a counseling issue or some other risk that is out there that lawyers are working through, there's always we lawyers, are looking at the legal issues, right? We're not, that's the lane that we're in. We're not necessarily business people trained to think about all these things. But I think in getting to know your client, depending on the issue, understand, okay, for example, there might be, the client might want to bring a lawsuit. And in bringing the lawsuit, they're going to get some exposure. And how is that going to impact their operations? How is it going to impact their relationship with their customers or their employees or their investors? And so thinking through like, okay, if we're going to do this, if we're going to move forward on this, we need to think like from the C-suite, perspective, what is the impact to our business once we file, once a, pocket filed, whatever, what's coming after that operationally. And so I think it's the operations that oftentimes can be the miss for lawyers, or yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have more to add on that one, but I do think I think it'd be a great class to have in law school, and I think that if you're in an organization as a lawyer where you don't feel like this is something that sort of base level foundational acceptance of the relationship between legal crises and public relations crises is there, I think you should raise it and then find the opportunity to bring in experts. And this is obviously your area of expertise, Stacy, who know how it works to help educate.
Anything one should in that position should look for in an expert to bring in, or how to seek out someone to do that kind of work?
Well, in the private sector, there's so many talented people out there who, do this sort of work. I like to encourage people to have someone in their Rolodex, so to speak, that they could call. And sometimes maybe it's just a short phone call. It's not a full engagement, but it's like, hey, we're going through this. Can I bounce something off of you? And so then at least they have a relationship. So then if something happens, you're not floundering around trying to like interview people. And the other thing is maybe to develop a relationship with someone, and just to have them at the ready. And so maybe it is a retainer where you bring someone in, you get them familiar with the organization a little bit, introduce them to some people. Maybe they do some backgrounding, and then they're ready. I mean, I've done that before, but I think there's so many talented people in this market that, a quick Google search will pull them up.
Great. We're down to our last minute or two. Any question in the chat you'd like to make a quick answer to? Anything else you'd like to add, or last words you have for the attendees today?
I might just jump, just looking at the chat. Somebody asked about, can you make a general statement about how to respond when someone is wrong on social media, for instance, wrong about what they posted about your client? And I think, building on the prior conversation on this front, I think the answer in short is yes. But I think, Stacy, you mentioned this, whether it's citizen journalists or others, the big question you have to ask is, are you going to fan the flames? And are you going to, what you want to avoid is some sort of, I think, lengthy tit for tat with somebody on Twitter or X or Facebook or whatever, where you're down a rabbit hole. But I do think there are moments where it's appropriate to jump in and correct the record in the social media space. And I don't know that I have any thoughts about the Otani, the baseball crisis, or National Association of Realtors piece, but Richard Newberry asked about written materials that lawyers should review to learn about this topic. Stacey, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
There's some books out there on crisis communications. You could Google that. I have a blog that has a ton of articles about, construction accidents and, media relations and crises, social media crises. So, but yeah, there's information out there. And then I just wanted to respond really quickly. I know it's one, but instances where people or brands did not come back and what distinguishes them from the ones that do. I think sometimes most of the clients that I've worked with have always come back. They might have come back in something different if it's an individual, but all the businesses and organizations that come back. The thing that might distinguish it is if it involves a criminal issue and they, are, convicted and go to prison. And that in that way they don't come back. But even when they get out, they still have the opportunity to come back. And we've seen that time and time again in the larger national sphere.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, so we are at time. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. Thank you Stacy and Chris, for sharing your expertise with us. It was a very interesting conversation and extremely helpful, I think. So thank you.
Thanks, you all. Appreciate it.